At one point, does singing become a clerical task? And also, where does congregational singing fit into this? In any of the centuries, before musical notation.
Yes, this is the congregational singing is a very particular and interesting question. I mean, it's obvious from the sermons of St. Augustine, that St. Augustine of Hippo in North Africa, that in the fourth century, the congregation expects to do some community singing, so to speak. They expect to join in. Now, I think, what we need to bear in mind here is the fact that the Latin language, which would be the language of St. Augustine's church, of course, the Latin language is evolving very rapidly. After all, Latin is on the way to becoming French, Spanish, Italian, Catalan, Provençal, and so on, Romanian. And I mean, Augustine already shows that some of his congregation were producing ungrammatical forms of Latin when they sang.
Hmm.
And gradually, I think what happens is that there is an increasing intolerance of what you might call vulgarity in Latin speech amongst the clergy. And the laity are progressively silenced and are not really allowed to take part.
Hmm.
This is all part of a much bigger story, which is a very complex story, and we probably don't have time to go into it, which is how Latin and Romance, how, for example, Latin and French come to be different languages.
Right.
So, for example, if you take a 6th century historian like Gregory of Tours, when you look at his Latin on the page, it looks like Latin. I mean, it's got passives and it's got Latin spelling. But what he sounded like when he actually spoke it out loud is a very, very difficult question to answer. He may
Hmm.
have sounded like someone speaking a very, very early form of French.
Hmm.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because Latin spelling and Latin grammar was the only formal way of writing down the way he spoke that Gregory of Tours had. But his actual speech was already evolving on the way towards French.
Hmm.
So my view would be that if some of the earliest musical notation exists to make sure, not necessarily that singers, but that deacons singing readings and so on, and priests singing, intoning readings, would pronounce the Latin correctly and wouldn't drop syllables in the way they would do when they were
Hmm.
speaking vulgarly. I'm sorry, this is getting a little bit erudite and perhaps a little bit remote from the interests of some of your listeners, but it is fundamental. Let me give you an example. We know, for example, that in the 8th century, when a litany was being sung and the saints were being called upon to intercede for the human community, the Latin at the end of each invocation would be tu illum adjuva. You help him, where the him is the king. Tu illum adjuva, something like that. But there is one source that spells it out as essentially Romance, tu lo juva. Tu lo juva. Now that is a very evolved form of what looks like on the page tu illum adjuva. Do you see where I'm going with this? And
Hmm.
the clergy became increasingly intolerant of having the laity singing in this vulgar speech.
Hmm.
So the laity is
Interesting.
silenced, and they don't take by the 6th or 7th century. They don't take part anymore. The clergy don't want them to do it, and the clergy have become the guardians of a particularly correct form of Latin for the
Hmm.
liturgy.
Right. Would the
They
would
say
the would the
they
laity
say
have been singing like hymns separately from the actual parts of the mass or anything like that?
or
Still.
possibly or singing nothing.
Hmm.
That the singing is being done increasingly by what you might very loosely and, of course, probably incorrectly call professionals.